By 1943, the war had entered a new, grinding phase. The German Sixth Army had evaporated at Stalingrad, and the vaunted Afrika Korps, starved of fuel and reinforcements, was being squeezed into a small pocket in Tunisia. It was here that entire armies simply ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers surrendered en masse. This was not a trickle, it was a flood. Allied commanders were faced with a staggering logistical problem. What to do with 250,000 prisoners of war? England was already strained, and the camps in North Africa were insecure. The only viable solution was an audacious one: ship them across the Atlantic to the United States. For the German soldiers, this was the beginning of a terrifying journey. They were leaving a world they knew, a war they had been told they were winning, and heading to the very continent their propaganda, led by Goebbels, had painted as a primitive, degenerate land of gangsters, cowboys, and racial impurity, a nation supposedly on the verge of collapse. Their arrival was the first crack in their indoctrination. They expected to see ports like Hamburg or Kiel shattered by bombs with a gaunt, terrified populace. Instead, they sailed past the Statue of Liberty into a New York City that was fully illuminated, vibrant, and utterly untouched by war. The skyscrapers stood in perfect, arrogant splendor. On the docks, they were given food. They expected watery soup and black bread. They were handed thick slices of white bread, cheese, and tins of fruit. Most shockingly, they were given coffee with real sugar and cigarettes as they were loaded onto trains, not cattle. Cars, but clean passenger cars with cushioned seats, and sent deep into the American interior. The shock intensified. For days, they stared out the windows at a nation that was not just surviving, but thriving. They saw endless, bountiful fields of wheat and corn, vast herds of cattle, and tidy farmhouses with automobiles parked out front. They saw children playing on green lawns, not picking through rubble. This was not a country on its knees. It was a giant, sleeping peacefully, while hundreds of thousands of enlisted men were sent to sprawling camps. A small, elite contingent was handled with special care. These were the captured German generals, men like Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of the Afrika Korps, and Wilhelm von Thoma, a Panzer legend. These were not, for the most part, rabid street corner Nazis. They were the Prussian military aristocracy, the Junker caste, men who believed their lineage and training made them superior to everyone, including their own Führer and especially their uncouth American captors. They were flown, not shipped, to America and interred in special, high-security general slaughter like Camp Clinton in Mississippi and Camp Alva in Oklahoma. Their separation was intentional. The Allies did not want these charismatic, authoritative commanders organizing resistance or maintaining morale among the enlisted prisoners. They arrived defeated, but their arrogance, defiance, and profound sense of superiority remained perfectly intact. Life for the captured generals was a surreal existence, a true golden cage. The Geneva Convention dictated that officers could not be forced to perform manual labor and must be treated according to their rank. They were housed in comfortable private or semi-private rooms in officers' quarters, not in crowded barracks. They were given a stipend in camp scrip to buy sundries. They even had orderlies, low-ranking German POWs, to clean their quarters, polish their boots, and serve them their meals in a separate officers' mess. They spent their days in crushing, monotonous boredom, reading books from the camp library, tending small gardens, playing chess, and endlessly debating the military blunders that had led to their capture. But beneath this veneer of civility was a profound psychological torture. These were men who had commanded armies of 100,000 men, and now their entire world was a few acres of dust, enclosed by barbed wire and the mocking, empty horizon. Outside the wire, the arsenal of democracy was straining. Millions of young American farmers, laborers, and factory workers were now GIs fighting in Europe and the Pacific. This created a dire labor shortage on the home front, especially in agriculture. In 1943 and 1944, America faced the very real prospect of crops rotting in the fields, which would not only starve its own people, but also its allies. The government made a deeply controversial, but pragmatic decision. It would use its vast, untapped pool of German POWs as a workforce. Under the Emergency Farm Labor Program, hundreds of thousands of enlisted prisoners were leased out to local farms, canneries, and logging operations. They were trucked out every morning, their work clothes stamped with a large, unmistakable PW, to harvest the very food that would fuel the war machine that was destroying their homeland. For the generals, this was the ultimate indignity. While they were exempt from labor, their camps were often adjacent to the enlisted men's, and they were frequently transported through the very towns and farmlands where their former soldiers were working. They would ride, stiff-backed and humiliated, in American military trucks, staring out at their men picking cotton in Mississippi or harvesting sugar beets in Minnesota. More than that, they saw the enemy's society up close. They saw small-town main streets with drugstores selling ice cream, movie theaters playing Hollywood films, and gas stations with no lines. They saw civilians who looked at them not with the fiery hatred of a blood feud, but with a strange, almost nonchalant curiosity. This daily, mundane exposure to a peaceful, functioning, and astonishingly prosperous society began to wage a psychological war against their entire belief system. In the small rural communities of the Midwest, the lines blurred. The farmers who ran these operations were not ideologues. They were deeply practical, often religious men, independent and tied to the land. They were businessmen whose product was food, and the POWs were their temporary labor. In states like Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, many of these farmers were second or third generation German Americans. They spoke their grandparents' language. They would listen to the prisoners' stories and see in them a reflection of their own heritage. They saw the enlisted men working hard, and they saw the generals, sometimes assigned to light supervisory duties, watching from the sidelines, radiating a useless, stiff-backed pride. It was a strange relationship, one of pure pragmatism mixed with a dawning, human curiosity. The story, which happened in variations across the country, goes like this. It was a Sunday, a day of rest, though the harvest waited for no one. An Iowa farmer, supervising a small detail of prisoners that included a few high-ranking officers, heard the dinner bell ring from his farmhouse. His wife had prepared the traditional Sunday meal. He looked at the guards, who were local men, just as weary as he was. He looked at the German generals, standing apart, trying to maintain their dignity, and he made a decision that was, in its own way, an act of defiance against the very concept of total war. He walked over to them, wiped his hands on his overalls, and in broken English mixed with gestures, he pointed to the officers, then to his house, and made a clear motion of eating. Come and see. He might have said Essen. He was inviting the enemy's high command to his family's dinner table. For the German generals, this was an impossible, terrifying moment. Their entire indoctrination screamed that this was a trap. They had been told that American civilians were gangsters and savages, a lynch mob waiting for a chance to enter a civilian's home. Away from the structured protocol of the camp was to surrender all control. What was this? A psychological test? Would they be mocked, poisoned, paraded for humiliation? One general reportedly asked the American guard, who simply shrugged and said, "He just wants you to eat." Torn between their ingrained suspicion, their military pride, and a deep, gnawing hunger for something other than camp food, they made the decision, cautiously, with their guards in tow. They began the longest walk of their lives, the few hundred feet from the field to the farmhouse porch, crossing a line between war and peace that they thought was absolute. They stepped inside. The first assault was sensory. The house was warm, and it smelled not of disinfectant and boiled cabbage, but of roasting chicken, baking bread, and real, percolated coffee. The second shock was the sight. The farmer's wife, wearing an apron, regarded them with a shy, nervous curiosity, but not a trace of hatred. His children peeked from behind her skirts. A radio played quiet music, not blaring propaganda, and then they saw the table. It was laden with food, not a banquet, but a simple Sunday meal of staggering plenty. A large platter of roasted chicken, a heaping bowl of mashed potatoes, another of green beans, a stick of yellow butter, a pitcher of milk, and a loaf of fresh, white bread. Two men who had come from a continent starving under a total war economy of ersatz coffee and black bread. This casual, effortless abundance in a simple farmhouse was more powerful, more shocking than an entire armored division. They sat, their postures ramrod straight, their uniforms seeming absurdly out of place in the simple, wood-paneled dining room. The farmer sat at the head of the table, said a simple grace, and then gestured for them to eat. "Help yourselves, gentlemen." The generals, men who had dined at Hitler's Wolf Lair, ate in stunned, profound silence. The farmer's wife offered them more chicken. The children stared, their initial fear fading into simple curiosity. The farmer, sensing the chasm of silence, tried to make small talk. He didn't talk about the war. He talked about the land, the rain, the harvest. He asked them, perhaps through a guard or a bilingual child, if they were farmers. The sheer, profound, devastating normalcy of the act of family sharing its Sunday meal was the most powerful psychological weapon they had ever faced. The single meal achieved what years of Allied bombing and formal re-education programs could not. It instantly vaporized their entire propaganda-built universe. The starving, decadent, Jewish-run America was a lie. The barbaric American enemy was a decent, hard-working, pious man who shared his table. The most crushing realization was not the kindness, but the strength it implied. This farmer was not putting on a show. This was just Sunday. A nation that could feed its enemies this casually, in the middle of a world war, without a second thought, was a nation that could not be defeated. Their entire sacrifice, the millions of dead, the ruined cities, it was all in service of a monstrous lie, and they had been fools to believe it. Their whole ideological foundation didn't just crack, it disintegrated. They were escorted back to the Generalslager in the twilight. They barely spoke. What was there to say? How could they articulate what they had just witnessed? How could they reconcile the image of that table, piled high with food, with the desperate, starving letters they received from their own wives in Berlin or Dresden? Letters that described hiding in cellars from Allied bombers. A deep, profound shame settled on them, not just the shame of defeat, but the shame of having been so wrong. They realized they were not fighting a weak, crumbling society. They were fighting a confident, prosperous, and astonishingly humane one. A society so strong in its own values that it could afford to be kind to its most bitter enemies, even at the height of a war for survival. This incident was not unique. In small ways, all across America, this denazification by example was taking place. For the enlisted prisoners, it was the farmer who bought them a cold Coca-Cola from the general store, the guard who shared a pack of Lucky Strikes, the cannery worker who slipped them an extra sandwich. It was a grassroots, impromptu re-education program run not by the government, but by the people. The simple, human decency, this refusal to see the prisoners as subhuman monsters, was devastatingly effective. It chipped away at years of hate-filled indoctrination, proving that the American way of life was not a slogan, but a reality they could see and touch. When the war finally ended, these generals, and the hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners, were repatriated. They returned to a homeland that was not just defeated, but annihilated. They stepped off ships into the rubble of Hamburg, Berlin, and Cologne, finding their families starving and their nation in ruins. They knew that the same America that had crushed them with industrial might could now, with the stroke of a pen, let their entire nation starve to death. But they also carried with them the memory of the Iowa farmhouse. So when the first care packages arrived, part of the Marshall Plan, and they opened them to find flour, lard, coffee, and sugar, the very same items from the farmer's table, it was not seen as a cynical trick. It was seen as a promise, the continuation of that Sunday dinner. That memory became the fertile soil in which the new German-American alliance, one of the most stable in modern history, would be planted. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this, then hit the like button and subscribe for more daily videos.